A wild gray wolf, trapped in a raging river, its strength fading fast, its body slipping beneath the icy waters. No one would dare risk their life for a predator like this. But then, a man saw it. And in that split second, he made an unbelievable decision. What he did next would defy all logic, all instinct. And it would change both their lives forever. Would you have done the same? Stay with us to witness a story of survival, trust, and the unexpected bond between man and beast. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss more incredible stories like this one. Asterisk. The roar of the river was deafening. Daniel Carter had seen floods before, but never like this. The recent storm had turned the once peaceful waters into a raging current, sweeping away everything in its path. Then he saw it. A wolf, a massive gray beast, caught in the unforgiving flow, fighting for its life. Its fur was slick with water, its limbs flailing uselessly as it struggled to stay afloat. Every time it managed to lift its head for air, another surge of water crashed over it, forcing it under. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He should walk away. This was nature. A predator like this wasn't meant to be saved. But then, the wolf locked eyes with him. Even from the distance, Daniel could see the raw fear in its golden gaze. This wasn't just an animal fighting to survive. It was begging. His heart slammed against his ribs. There was no time to think. He ran. Without hesitation, Daniel threw off his jacket and plunged into the icy water. The cold hit him like a truck. His breath vanished as the freezing current pulled at his limbs, threatening to drag him under. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself forward, his eyes locked on the wolf's sinking form. The current was merciless. His boots slipped on the uneven riverbed as he fought against the water. Every movement felt like dragging himself through quicksand, but he kept going. The wolf disappeared beneath the surface. No! Daniel lunged forward, reaching out blindly, his fingers barely brushing against wet fur. He grabbed hold. The wolf thrashed weakly, too exhausted to fight, but still struggling. The moment Daniel felt its full weight, panic set in. The animal was heavier than he expected, and now the current had them both. Daniel's boots lost grip. His body was swept off balance. The river dragged him under. Darkness swallowed everything. His lungs burned. His mind screamed at him to let go, to save himself. The wolf's fur slipped through his fingers, but he clenched his grip tighter. No, he refused to let this animal die. With one final, desperate kick, he surged upward, breaking through the surface with a gasp of air. The river was still trying to take them, but Daniel spotted an exposed tree root jutting out from the bank just ahead. It was his only chance. Summoning every last ounce of strength, he pulled the wolf closer and lunged for it. His fingers closed around the root. For a terrifying second, he thought it would rip free, but it held. With one arm wrapped around the wolf, he used his free hand to drag them toward the shore, inch by agonizing inch. His muscles screamed, his ribs ached. But finally, his knees hit solid ground. With a final pull, he dragged himself and the wolf onto the riverbank, collapsing beside it in the wet grass. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniel gasped for breath, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. The wolf lay still, water dripping from its fur, its chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements. It was alive. Barely. Daniel turned his head, meeting those golden eyes once more. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something he never expected: trust. Daniel lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths. His entire body trembled from the cold, his fingers stiff and numb from the freezing water. Beside him, the wolf was just as still. Water pooled around its drenched fur, its body limp against the muddy ground. Its breathing was weak, shallow, too shallow. Daniel forced himself up, his arms shaking beneath his weight. His instincts screamed at him. The wolf wasn't safe yet. It had barely survived the river, but if it didn't warm up soon, it wouldn't make it. His own clothes clung to him like ice, but he pushed that aside. This animal had just fought harder for its life than anything he had ever seen, and he wasn't about to let it die now. "Come on," Daniel muttered, his voice hoarse. He reached out cautiously, his fingers hovering over the wolf's wet fur. He expected resistance, a warning growl, anything. But the animal didn't move. It was too weak to fight him. That realization sent a sharp pang through his chest. He hesitated only a second longer before pressing his hands against the wolf's side, feeling for movement. The fur was thick, but beneath it, he could feel the slow, unsteady rise and fall of its ribs. It was still breathing, but barely. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. He had to act fast. Shelter, heat, now. His cabin was too far away, and he couldn't carry the wolf in this state. But there, just beyond the tree line, he spotted an overhang of rocks, partially hidden by thick brush. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Gritting his teeth, he shoved himself to his feet. His body protested every movement, but he ignored it. He stumbled toward the wolf and crouched down, slipping his arms underneath its massive form. Dead weight. The wolf barely stirred as Daniel lifted it, its head lolled against his chest, its damp fur cold against his skin. The animal was so much heavier than he expected, and every step sent sharp pain lancing through his muscles. But he didn't stop. Step by step, breath by breath, he carried the wolf toward the rocky shelter. By the time he reached the overhang, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. With a grunt, he lowered the wolf onto the driest patch of ground he could find. Then he collapsed beside it, gasping for breath. The wind howled through the trees, biting against his frozen skin. They wouldn't last long like this. His fingers fumbled at his waist, reaching for the lighter in his soaked pocket. His hands were shaking too hard to be steady, but after 3 failed attempts, a spark finally caught. The dry grass ignited instantly, and Daniel fed it twigs, then branches, until a small but fierce fire crackled between them. The warmth was immediate, but it wasn't enough. The wolf hadn't moved. Its breathing was still too slow. Daniel hesitated for only a second before making a choice he never thought he'd have to make. He shrugged off his soaked jacket and dragged the wolf closer. Pressing his body against the animal's side, he used his own heat to keep it alive. The wolf let out a weak sound, not a growl, not a whimper, just something faint and exhausted. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He just stayed there, shielding them both from the wind, listening to the unsteady rhythm of the wolf's breath. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then, just as exhaustion threatened to pull him under. The wolf shifted. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The golden eyes cracked open, hazy, unfocused. But watching him, a silent moment stretched between them. A moment that would change everything. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the rock walls. The warmth was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, but Daniel barely noticed. His focus was on the wolf. The golden eyes, hazy and unfocused just moments ago, now locked onto him with sharp intensity. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The wolf was awake, and now it was aware of who had saved it. For the first time since dragging the animal from the river, Daniel realized just how close they were. The wolf's massive body was still pressed against his, its wet fur cold against his skin. He could feel its shallow breaths, the slow rise and fall of its chest. But now, the tension in the air was undeniable. Daniel knew better than to move too quickly. A cornered and injured predator was the most dangerous kind. The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, its gaze unreadable. Then, with a deep, ragged breath, it tried to move. A low, painful whimper escaped his throat, and Daniel instinctively reached out to steady it. His fingers barely brushed against the thick fur before a deep growl rumbled from the wolf's chest. Daniel froze. The sound wasn't a direct threat, not yet, but it was a warning. Don't touch me. His heart pounded. He had risked his life to save this animal, had nearly drowned in the process, had shared his own body heat to keep it alive. And now it was threatening him? He exhaled slowly, forcing his body to stay relaxed. If he showed fear, the wolf would see him as weak. If he challenged it, he'd be seen as a threat. Neither option ended well for him. So instead, he did nothing. The wolf continued to stare at him, its ears twitching slightly, as if testing the air between them. Then, to Daniel's surprise, it lowered its head back down. The growl faded, replaced by exhausted breathing. Daniel didn't dare move. Minutes passed in tense silence. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and the weight of everything pressed down on both of them. He studied the wolf carefully. Its body was still weak, still shivering slightly. It needed rest, not a fight. Daniel slowly leaned back against the rock wall, watching as the wolf's eyes flickered half-closed. It was choosing not to attack him. For now. Daniel let out a quiet breath, his muscles aching from tension. He had seen plenty of wolves in the wild before, but never this close. He had never seen one hesitate, never seen one study a human like this, like it was trying to understand him. As the minutes stretched, Daniel realized something. This wolf should be with its pack. Wolves didn't survive alone. They hunted together, thrived together. But this one had been alone when it fell into the river. Had it been separated, or had it been left behind? The thought stirred something deep in Daniel's chest. He had always believed in leaving nature alone, never interfering, never taming what was meant to be wild. But now, this wolf's survival was in his hands. His eyes flickered back to the golden ones watching him, and for the first time he wondered, did the wolf know it too? The fire flickered, casting warm light against the rock walls, but the air between Daniel and the wolf remained thick with tension. Neither moved. The wolf's golden eyes, now sharp and focused, locked onto him. Its muscles were still weak, but the awareness in its gaze told Daniel that it knew exactly what was happening. It was watching him, testing him. Daniel knew better than to break eye contact completely. He had spent enough time in the wild to understand how predators thought. Hesitation meant weakness, but a direct challenge could mean death. So he waited. The wolf twitched its ears slightly, as if deciding what to do. Then, painfully slow, it shifted its weight and tried to stand. A sharp breath hissed through its teeth as its legs trembled beneath it. The fight with the river had drained its strength, and the cold had stolen what little energy remained. Daniel tensed as the wolf staggered, barely catching itself before collapsing back down onto the frozen ground. For a long moment, it didn't move. Then, a low, frustrated growl rumbled from deep in its chest. Daniel exhaled slowly. It wasn't angry at him. It was angry at itself. He understood that feeling, the helplessness, the fight to regain control over something bigger than you. For a brief second, he saw himself in the wolf, injured, weak, but refusing to surrender. Instinct told him to let it be, to let the animal figure things out on its own. But something else, a voice in the back of his mind, one that he rarely listened to, whispered otherwise. So against all logic, Daniel shifted slightly, reaching toward his pack. The movement was slow, calculated, non-threatening. The wolf watched him carefully, its ears flicking forward. Daniel pulled out a strip of dried meat from one of his emergency rations. Nothing much, but it was something. He had no idea if the wolf would take food from a human, but it was weak and it needed to regain its strength. With a steady hand, he extended the food towards it. The wolf's nose twitched, nostrils flaring slightly as it caught the scent. But it didn't move. Daniel held his breath. He had expected the animal to lunge forward, to snap up the food without hesitation. But instead, the wolf did something he never saw coming. It looked at him first, not at the food, at him, like it was trying to understand the offer before accepting it. Daniel's pulse pounded. For the first time, it wasn't just a wild animal in front of him. It was something more. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the wolf leaned forward and took the food from his hand, gently. Daniel didn't move, barely even breathed. The wolf chewed slowly, its golden eyes still locked onto him. Then finally, it swallowed and lowered its head beside the fire. Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. This was the first step, the first test, and maybe, just maybe, the first sign of trust. The night pressed in around them, the fire flickering low, casting long shadows against the rock walls. The wind howled through the trees outside, carrying the distant creaks of ice shifting along the river's edge. But inside this small shelter, there was only silence. Daniel's body ached. His fingers were stiff from the cold, his soaked clothes still clinging to his skin, but he couldn't take his eyes off the wolf. The animal had accepted his food. It had eaten from his hand. That simple act shouldn't have meant anything, but it did, because wolves didn't trust humans, not unless they chose to. The gray wolf lay curled near the fire now, its massive body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. It wasn't asleep, not fully. Its ears flicked slightly with every gust of wind, its golden eyes half-lidded but still aware. It was watching him. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. His body was screaming for sleep, but could he even risk closing his eyes? The wolf was still a predator. Injured or not, it was strong enough to rip him apart in seconds. Yet something deep in his gut told him it wouldn't. Not now. They had crossed some kind of invisible threshold, a silent understanding. Daniel rubbed his temples, exhaustion pressing down on him. How the hell had he gotten here? A day ago, he had been a man hiking alone, just trying to escape the noise of the world. Now, he was stranded in the middle of nowhere, sharing a fire with a wild animal. His rational side told him this wouldn't last. The wolf would regain its strength, and then it would leave. That was how it had to be. Right? He leaned back against the rock wall, watching the flames dance. His body still shivered, his clothes damp, but the fire was enough to keep him from freezing. He glanced at the wolf again. It was still staring at him. Not in a hostile way, not in fear, just watching. Like it was still trying to understand him. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "What the hell are we doing?" he muttered under his breath. To his absolute shock, the wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. His breath hitched. It had recognized the sound. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He had no idea what the hell was happening between them. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was something more, and neither of them knew what came next. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly in the cold night. Outside, the wind had settled, leaving behind an eerie stillness in the forest. Daniel's body was heavy with exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. He had spent the night side by side with a wild predator, and yet the wolf had done nothing to harm him. It should have left by now, but it hadn't. The gray wolf still lay curled near the fire, its golden eyes barely visible beneath heavy lids. It had shifted in its sleep, moving closer to the warmth, its body no longer tense, no longer on guard. Somewhere between the battle against the river and the quiet hours beside the fire, something had changed. Daniel wasn't sure if it was trust or just mutual survival, but whatever it was real. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up, his limbs stiff from the cold. His soaked clothes had dried enough to keep him from freezing, but he could still feel the damp chill clinging to his skin. The wolf's ears twitched at his movement. Daniel froze. For a brief moment, he thought this was it, the moment the wolf finally decided to leave, but instead the animal just blinked at him, watching with lazy curiosity. Not hostility, not fear, just acknowledgement. Daniel exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp air. He stood, stretching his aching muscles. His body still felt battered, but at least he could move now. It was time to go. He needed to find his way back to civilization. The storm had passed, and if he started moving now, he could reach the trails before sundown. But as he turned toward the clearing, he hesitated. Would the wolf follow? Or was this the end of whatever strange bond had formed between them? He glanced back. The wolf was staring at him again, its head slightly tilted, almost like it sensed his hesitation. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just a wild animal anymore, not to him. And somehow, he wasn't just another human to the wolf either. He swallowed hard, then took a step forward. The wolf's ears twitched. Another step. Then softly, almost imperceptibly, the wolf rose to its feet. Daniel's pulse spiked. It wasn't running. It wasn't leaving. It was following. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel gave a small nod, as if giving permission for something he didn't fully understand himself. Without a sound, the wolf padded forward, keeping exactly one step behind him, not as prey, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Together, they disappeared into the trees, a man and a wolf, side by side, and neither would ever be the same again. Sometimes, the wild chooses you. This man thought he was saving a wolf, But in the end, they saved each other. Do you believe that trust can exist between humans and wild animals? Tell us in the comments. And if this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves incredible tales of survival and connection with nature.